The first modern Brits had dark to black skin and blue eyes. Romans stationed African soldiers on Hadrian's Wall. Medieval Europe venerated a black saint as their greatest warrior. Were there black people in ancient Europe? It's a question that sparks heated debates in comment sections, academic conferences, and even political rallies. Some call it rewriting history for political correctness. Others say it's simply revealing the history that was always there. The topic has been described as everything from groundbreaking research to dangerous propaganda. Opinion is split sharply. On one side, geneticists and archaeologists present DNA evidence and skeletal remains. On the other, critics claim this is modern identity politics projected onto the past. But here's what's undeniable. Recent archaeological discoveries and DNA analysis have completely transformed our understanding of ancient Europe. The evidence comes from the bones themselves, extracted from caves, Roman graveyards, and medieval burial sites across the continent. Honestly, the story of racial diversity in ancient Europe is one of the most fascinating and misunderstood chapters of human history. This isn't about modern politics. This is about archaeological evidence, genetic science, and historical records that have been sitting in museums and archives for decades, some for over a century. I promise you this: the deeper we go into the archaeological record, the more complex the picture becomes. Every layer we examine reveals populations more diverse than most textbooks suggest. This is the tale of migrations, genetic adaptations, and human communities that challenge our assumptions about the past. It's time to examine the actual evidence. The story begins not in Europe, but in Africa, approximately 45,000 years ago. As massive glacial ice sheets covering Europe began to melt, groups of anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, prepared to make one of the most significant migrations in human history. These weren't the first hominids in Europe. Neanderthals had inhabited the continent for hundreds of thousands of years, adapted to the cold climate with stocky builds and pale skin. But around 45,000 BC, something changed. Modern humans from Africa began crossing into Europe, likely through multiple routes, across the Strait of Gibraltar, through the Middle East, and possibly via Sicily from North Africa. One of the earliest and most significant discoveries came from the Grimaldi Caves in Italy, near the French border. In 1901, during excavations funded by Prince Albert I of Monaco, archaeologists uncovered a remarkable burial site in the Grotte des Enfants, the Cave of the Children. The remains belonged to two individuals, an adolescent male around 16 to 17 years old and an adult female over 50. Both were buried with ceremony, red ochre staining their bones, perforated marine shells as jewelry, and stone tools placed alongside them. This was no accidental death. These were ritual burials, suggesting a sophisticated culture with spiritual beliefs. When anthropologist René Verneau examined the skeletons, he was struck by their features. The skulls had high vaultings, wide nasal openings, and facial characteristics that reminded him of sub-Saharan African populations. The bodies were gracile and slender, smaller than the robust Cro-Magnon remains found elsewhere in Europe. Sir Arthur Keith, a prominent British anatomist, noted in 1911 that the Grimaldi remains showed what he called an intermediate race, exhibiting both African and European characteristics. He theorized these people may have crossed from North Africa into Europe when sea levels were lower, making the journey possible across land bridges. For decades, these remains were classified as evidence of Negroid populations in prehistoric Europe. But was this accurate, or were early archaeologists imposing racial categories where none belonged? Fast forward to 1903, in Somerset, England. Workers improving drainage at Gough's Cave in Cheddar Gorge made a startling discovery: a nearly complete human skeleton, buried alone in a chamber. The skeleton was male, approximately 10,000 years old, the oldest nearly complete skeleton ever found in Britain. For over a century, Cheddar Man sat in London's Natural History Museum. Various reconstructions were attempted, always depicting him with pale skin and light hair, the way we imagined ancient Britons looked. Then, in 2018, everything changed. A team of scientists from University College London and the Natural History Museum extracted DNA from Cheddar Man's skull, specifically from the petrous bone of the temporal bone, one of the densest bones in the human body, excellent for preserving ancient DNA. The results shocked even the researchers themselves. Professor Mark Thomas of UCL Genetics stated, "To go beyond what the bones tell us and get a scientifically based picture of what he actually looked like is a remarkable achievement." The DNA analysis revealed Cheddar Man had dark brown to black skin, blue or blue-green eyes, dark curly hair, lactose intolerance, unable to digest milk as an adult. Dr. Tom Booth from the Natural History Museum explained, "Until recently, it was always assumed that humans quickly adapted to have paler skin after entering Europe about 45,000 years ago. Pale skin is better at absorbing UV light and helps humans avoid vitamin D deficiency in climates with less sunlight." But the evidence showed otherwise. Cheddar Man lacked all the genetic variants for lighter skin pigmentation that are common in Europeans today. And Cheddar Man wasn't alone. Dr. Johan Diekman, who worked on the genetic analysis, noted, "We found that British Mesolithic hunter-gatherers were closely related to other hunter-gatherers living previously in Western Europe, and shared some aspects of their appearance. Like their Mesolithic continental relatives, they had typically dark skin, but light eye pigmentation." Studies of dozens of Upper Paleolithic and Mesolithic skeletons from across Western Europe, France, Spain, Luxembourg, Hungary, the Baltic, showed the same pattern. These ancient Europeans, living between 50,000 and 5,000 years ago, consistently lacked the skin-lightening genetic variants common today. In 2025, a groundbreaking study examined 348 ancient human genomes from people who lived between 45,000 and 1,700 years ago across Europe. The results were published by researchers at the University of Ferrara in Italy. Their conclusion was clear. Dark skin was widespread across Europe until approximately 3,000 years ago, well into the Iron Age. Some characteristics linked to lighter skin only started emerging around 14,000 years ago, but didn't become prevalent until much later. So, what happened? Why did skin color change? The answer lies in diet and migration. As long as hunter-gatherers ate fish rich in vitamin D, they could maintain darker skin even in low sunlight environments. But around 8,000 to 6,000 years ago, farming populations from the Middle East, who carried genetic variants for lighter skin, migrated into Europe. These Neolithic farmers brought agriculture and a carbohydrate-rich, grain-based diet that was poor in vitamin D. Without sufficient dietary vitamin D and living in low sunlight environments, lighter skin became an evolutionary advantage. It allowed better absorption of UV light, crucial for vitamin D production. Professor Hannes Schroeder from the University of Copenhagen, who studied a 5,700-year-old girl whose DNA was extracted from chewed birch pitch gum in Denmark, explains, "There is solid evidence to suggest that lighter skin tones only evolved in Europe within the last 5,000 years or so, and that people who lived in Europe before then typically had darker skin." The girl, nicknamed Lola, had dark skin, dark hair, and blue eyes, a combination that seems unusual today but was standard for prehistoric Europeans. When these findings were announced, they sparked immediate controversy. In 2018, the reconstruction of Cheddar Man's dark skin caused what researchers called a media shitstorm. Social media erupted. Some praised the research as groundbreaking. Others accused museums of blackwashing history for political reasons. In Denmark, when a museum displayed Lola's reconstruction showing her dark skin, they faced similar backlash and even had to defend themselves on national television. Dr. Schroeder addressed the criticism directly. It's not woke to portray prehistoric Europeans with dark skin. It's evolution. The science is clear. Multiple independent studies, using different samples from different time periods and different geographic regions, all point to the same conclusion. The first modern humans in Europe had dark skin, and this remained the dominant phenotype for tens of thousands of years. Approximately 10% of modern white British ancestry comes from these ancient Western European hunter-gatherers. Though subsequent migrations, particularly of Neolithic farmers and later Bronze Age populations, largely replaced the original inhabitants, the genetic legacy remains. Fast forward to 43 AD. The Roman Empire invades Britain under Emperor Claudius. The invasion force is massive, 4 legions plus thousands of auxiliary troops drawn from across the empire. And here's what most people don't realize. The Roman Empire was extraordinarily diverse. Legions recruited citizens from Italy, but auxiliary units came from everywhere: Gaul, Germania, Syria, North Africa, and beyond. To understand just how multicultural this invasion was, consider this. When Claudius made his triumphal entry into Camalodunum, modern Colchester, he brought war elephants from Africa. This wasn't just military strategy. It was theater designed to intimidate the local Iron Age Britons. From the very beginning, Africans were present in Roman Britain. In 193 AD, something remarkable happened. Lucius Septimius Severus, born in Leptis Magna in Roman Libya, became emperor of Rome. He was Rome's first African emperor. In 208 AD, Severus traveled to Britain with an army of over 40,000 troops to campaign in Caledonia, Scotland. His army included soldiers from across the empire, including North Africa. He established his headquarters in Eboracum, modern York, and ruled the entire Roman Empire from Britain for a period. Severus died in York in 211 AD, but his presence left a lasting impact. According to historical accounts, while inspecting troops on Hadrian's Wall, Severus encountered an Ethiopian soldier who offered him a garland of cypress leaves. The cypress was sacred to Pluto, the god of the underworld. Severus took this as a dark omen. The soldier reportedly said with sarcasm, "You have been all things, conquered all things. Now, O conqueror, be a god." Severus died shortly afterward. But this account confirms what archaeologists have since proven. African soldiers served on Hadrian's Wall. The evidence is literally written in stone. In 1934, archaeologists discovered an inscription at Burgh by Sands, near Carlisle, close to the western end of Hadrian's Wall. The inscription, dating from the 3rd century AD, references the Numerus Maurorum Aurelianorum, the unit of Aurelian Moors. This military unit was raised in the Roman province of Mauritania, covering modern-day Morocco and Algeria. Named in honor of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the unit could have been up to 500 soldiers strong. These weren't slaves or prisoners. They were professional Roman soldiers stationed at the fortress of Abalava, Burgh by Sands, to garrison Hadrian's Wall. A commemorative plaque at the site now reads, "The first recorded African community in Britain guarded a Roman fort on this site." But military presence is only part of the story. What about civilians? What about women? What about the upper classes? In 1901, during road construction in York, workers discovered a stone sarcophagus. Inside was the skeleton of a young woman, aged around 18 to 23, buried with extraordinary wealth. A jet bracelet from Yorkshire, an ivory bracelet from Africa, a glass unguentarium, perfume bottle, glass beads, a bronze mirror, earrings, pendants. The richness of her burial suggested high social status. But when archaeologists examined her skull in 2010, something remarkable emerged. Dr. Hella Eckhart, from the University of Reading, analyzed the skeletal remains from Roman York. The skull showed cranial features consistent with North African ancestry. Isotope analysis of her teeth revealed she grew up somewhere in southern Britain or the European continent, not in Africa itself. This means one or both of her parents were likely from North Africa, but she was born and raised in Roman Britain. She's now known as the Ivory Bangle Lady, one of the wealthiest residents of Roman York, a black woman holding high social status in 4th century Britain. Dr. Eckhart noted, Roman York was more ethnically diverse than modern York. The Ivory Bangle Lady wasn't unique. In 1951, a Roman cemetery was excavated in York, containing 350 skeletons. Several exhibited limb proportions and cranial features suggesting African ancestry. In 2010, the University of Reading re-examined skeletal remains from Roman burial sites in Gloucester, Winchester, and York. Their findings, approximately 1 in 5 Roman Britons were non-locals, people who had migrated from other parts of the empire. DNA analysis of Roman Londoners revealed individuals with North African ancestry. Archaeological evidence from Leicester showed similar patterns, people of African descent living and dying in Roman Britain. Here's the critical point. Romans didn't think about race the way we do. Skin color was just another physical characteristic, like eye color or height. What mattered in Roman society was citizenship, and whether you were free or enslaved. Those were the factors that determined your status, not skin color. Professor Mary Beard, the Cambridge classicist, explains, the Roman Empire was multi-ethnic and multicultural. Romans recruited soldiers from all conquered territories. It would be more surprising if there weren't Africans in Britain. When BBC produced an educational cartoon in 2017 showing a black Roman soldier in Britain, it sparked outrage online. Critics accused the BBC of blackwashing history. But historians pointed to the overwhelming evidence. Quintus Lollius Urbicus, a Berber from North Africa, served as governor of Roman Britain from 139 to 142 AD. The evidence isn't speculative. It's written in inscriptions, preserved in skeletons, and documented in historical texts. Moving forward to the Middle Ages, we encounter one of the most venerated figures in medieval Europe, Saint Maurice. According to the earliest accounts, written by Bishop Eucharius of Lyons around the 5th century, Maurice was born in Thebes, Egypt, around 250 AD. He rose to become commander of the Theban Legion, a unit of 6,000 Christian soldiers in the Roman army. In 287 AD, Emperor Maximian ordered Maurice's legion to march to Agonum, modern Saint Maurice en Valais, Switzerland, to suppress a Christian rebellion, or possibly to offer sacrifices to pagan gods. The accounts vary. Maurice, a devout Christian, refused. He would not kill fellow Christians or worship pagan deities. Maximian responded with decimation, executing every 10th soldier. Maurice still refused. Another decimation. Still refused. Finally, enraged, Maximian ordered the entire legion executed. The martyrdom of Saint Maurice became one of the most powerful stories in medieval Christianity. Here's where it gets interesting. Until the 13th century, Saint Maurice was always depicted as a white European in artistic representations. Then, in 1240, something changed. After fire destroyed Magdeburg Cathedral in Germany, it was rebuilt. During reconstruction, an unknown artist created a new statue of Saint Maurice and portrayed him with distinctly African features. The statue shows Maurice as a black African knight in full armor. Historian Gude Sukale Redlefsen describes the facial features. The relatively small opening in the closely fitting male coif was sufficient for the Magdeburg sculptor to produce a convincing characterization of Saint Maurice as an African. The facial proportions show typical alterations in comparison with European physiognomy. The broad, rounded contours of the nose are recognizable. This wasn't a one-off. Nearly 300 major images of the Black Saint Maurice have been catalogued across Germany and beyond. He became the patron saint of the Holy Roman Empire, venerated by emperors and common people alike. Several theories attempt to explain why Maurice was depicted as black. 1. Linguistic connection. His Latin name, Mauritius, derives from Maurus, meaning Moor or North African. 2. Egyptian origin. The Theban legion came from Egypt, specifically from Upper Egypt, which had strong connections to Nubia and sub-Saharan Africa. 3. Imperial propaganda. Emperor Frederick II may have promoted the Black Maurice as part of his claim to defend Christianity worldwide, countering French influence and positioning himself as protector of Christians in the Holy Land. 4. Historical accuracy. Maurice may actually have been from sub-Saharan Africa. Thebes, Luxor, was a crossroads where people of various African backgrounds lived and served in the Roman military. Between 1523 and 1540, people journeyed from across the Holy Roman Empire to Halle, Germany, to worship the relics of Saint Maurice. A monastery dedicated to him was founded in 1184. He was no marginal figure. Saint Maurice was celebrated as the celestial saint of Germany and the Knight of the Holy Lance, patron saint of soldiers, the Carolingian dynasty, and even the Vatican's Swiss Guard. Joel A. Rogers, in his 1934 book, 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro, described Maurice as a pure Negro, though modern historians debate his exact ethnicity given Egypt's diverse population. Today, debates rage about Maurice's depiction. Some historians argue his historical existence is uncertain. The earliest written accounts appear 150 years after his supposed martyrdom. Others note that depictions of Maurice as white persist in some regions, while black depictions dominate in Germanic areas. What's clear is this: for centuries, one of the most revered military saints in Christendom was portrayed and venerated as a black African. Medieval Europeans didn't see this as contradictory or problematic. The color of his skin didn't diminish his sanctity or martial valor. The veneration of Saint Maurice demonstrates that medieval Europe's relationship with race was far more complex than modern narratives suggest. So is there actually a conspiracy to hide evidence of black people in ancient Europe? The answer is more nuanced than a simple yes or no. It's true that for much of the 19th and 20th centuries, European history was written through a specific lens, one that emphasized European exceptionalism and racial homogeneity. Early anthropologists and archaeologists often worked within frameworks that assumed ancient Europe was uniformly white. When the Grimaldi remains were discovered showing Negroid features, some scholars dismissed them or downplayed their significance. When Cheddar Man's reconstruction initially showed pale skin in the 1990s, few questioned it. It fit expectations. The BBC controversy in 2017 is telling. When an educational cartoon showed a black Roman soldier in Britain, backed by solid archaeological evidence, it sparked fierce backlash and accusations of politically correct historical revision. These reactions revealed discomfort with evidence that challenges received narratives about European racial homogeneity. However, there's no organized conspiracy by archaeologists and geneticists to fabricate evidence. The opposite is true. Modern archaeological science has become extraordinarily rigorous. DNA extraction techniques, radiocarbon dating, isotope analysis, and craniometric studies have revolutionized our understanding of ancient populations. These aren't subjective interpretations. They're measurable, replicable scientific findings. The reason we know more about ancient population diversity today than 50 years ago isn't political correctness. It's better science. Dr. Schroeder puts it bluntly. Based on ancient DNA studies, it appears that Lola's look was much more common in prehistoric Europe than it is today. These discoveries have called into question the long-held belief that as people migrated from Africa to Europe, their complexion quickly became lighter. The real issue isn't hidden evidence. It's the interpretation and presentation of evidence within existing cultural narratives. For generations, textbooks showed ancient Britons as pale-skinned without questioning that assumption. Museum reconstructions defaulted to European features. The possibility of diversity wasn't seriously considered. Now, as genetic science forces revisions to these assumptions, resistance emerges. Not because the science is wrong, but because it challenges identity narratives. Geraldine Heng, a critical race theorist studying medieval Europe, notes that discussions of race in historical periods often become battlegrounds for contemporary political debates about immigration, national identity, and cultural heritage. Here's what we can say with confidence. 1. The first modern humans in Europe, from 45,000 to roughly 5,000 years ago, had dark skin. 2. Roman Britain was ethnically diverse, with documented African presence in military, civilian, and elite populations. 3. Medieval Europe recognized and venerated African figures, particularly in religious contexts. 4. Lighter skin pigmentation became dominant in Europe relatively recently, within the last 3,000 to 5,000 years. These aren't controversial claims among geneticists and archaeologists. They're based on overwhelming evidence from DNA analysis, skeletal studies, historical documents, and archaeological finds. The controversy exists not in the academic community, but in public discourse, where historical facts intersect with contemporary concerns about race, identity, and nationalism. So what's the full story? Modern humans evolved in Africa approximately 300,000 years ago. Around 70,000 to 100,000 years ago, small groups began migrating out of Africa into the Middle East, Asia, and eventually Europe. These migrants carried the skin pigmentation genes of their African origins, genes that produced melanin to protect against intense UV radiation. This dark skin was advantageous in Africa, but became less critical in the lower sunlight environments of Europe. However, as long as diet provided sufficient vitamin D, particularly from fish, dark skin wasn't a disadvantage. It could persist for tens of thousands of years. Around 45,000 years ago, modern humans crossed into Europe in significant numbers. They encountered and interbred with Neanderthals, who had separately evolved light skin as an adaptation to European climates. For the next 40,000 years, Europe was inhabited by hunter-gatherers who maintained dark skin pigmentation. The genetic evidence is unambiguous. Then, around 8,000 to 6,000 years ago, farming populations from Anatolia, modern Turkey, and the Near East migrated into Europe. These Neolithic farmers carried genetic variants for lighter skin, specifically the SLC24A5 and SLC45A2 genes. As farming spread, so did these genes. Agricultural diets lower in vitamin D created selective pressure, favoring lighter skin. Within a few thousand years, light skin became dominant across most of Europe. But this wasn't a simple replacement. It was waves of migration, mixing, and genetic exchange. Western hunter-gatherers, dark-skinned, blue-green-eyed; Neolithic farmers, lighter-skinned, brown-eyed; Yamnaya steppe pastoralists, mixed features, brought Indo-European languages; Bronze Age populations, Iron Age populations, historical migrations, Romans, Germanic tribes, Vikings, etc. Each wave added genetic diversity. Modern Europeans are mixtures of all these ancestral populations. Approximately 10% of indigenous British ancestry traces to the Western hunter-gatherers, like Cheddar Man. The rest comes from later migrations, mostly Neolithic farmers and Bronze Age pastoralists. The Roman period adds another layer of complexity. The empire facilitated unprecedented population movement. Soldiers from North Africa served in Britain. Merchants from Syria traded in Gaul. Enslaved people from all conquered territories moved throughout the empire. This wasn't multiculturalism in the modern sense. It was imperial integration, the deliberate mixing of populations to strengthen Roman control. But the result was increased genetic diversity across Europe, particularly in major urban centers and military zones. Medieval Europe saw continued, though reduced, contact with African populations. The Moorish conquest of Iberia, 711 to 1492 AD, crusades and trade with the Middle East, and North Africa diplomatic exchanges between Christian kingdoms and African Christian states like Ethiopia. The slave trade, both Islamic and later Atlantic, African people in medieval Europe occupied various social positions: soldiers, merchants, scholars, diplomats, saints, and yes, enslaved people. Their numbers were never large relative to the total population, but their presence was real and documented. Why does any of this matter? First, it's simply about accuracy. History should reflect evidence, not assumptions. For too long, ancient Europe was imagined as racially homogeneous, based more on cultural expectations than archaeological evidence. Modern science allows us to know what ancient people actually looked like. Ignoring that evidence because it's inconvenient or uncomfortable serves no one. Second, it complicates simplistic narratives about race and geography. The idea that black people belong in Africa, white people belong in Europe, is revealed as a modern construct, not a historical truth. Human populations have always been mobile. Skin color has adapted to local conditions over thousands of years. There's no primordial European race that has existed unchanged since time immemorial. Third, it challenges nationalist mythologies. Many European nationalist movements base their identity claims on supposed ancient homogeneity, the idea of pure ancestral populations. The genetic evidence demolishes this myth. Modern Europeans are mixtures of multiple ancestral populations from different geographic origins and time periods. Genetic diversity has always been part of European history. Of course, evidence can be misused in all directions. Some Afrocentric historians have made exaggerated claims, suggesting that ancient Greeks, Romans, or Celts were primarily black African populations. The evidence doesn't support this. The early European hunter-gatherers had dark skin, but they were genetically distinct from modern sub-Saharan African populations. They'd been separated for tens of thousands of years and had developed unique genetic profiles. Similarly, claiming Roman Britain or medieval Europe had large black populations overstates the evidence. African presence was real, but represented a minority within diverse imperial populations. The truth is always more complex and interesting than simplistic claims from any ideological position. Here's what the evidence actually shows. 1. Dark skin was standard in prehistoric Europe until relatively recently. 2. Roman Britain included documented African populations in military and civilian roles. 3. Medieval Europe had African presence, particularly in religious and royal contexts. 4. Skin pigmentation evolved in response to environmental and dietary factors. 5. Modern Europeans are genetic mixtures from multiple ancestral sources. None of this is speculative. It's based on DNA evidence, skeletal analysis, historical documents, and archaeological finds. The controversy exists not because the evidence is uncertain, but because it challenges cultural narratives about racial and national identity. So, were there black people in ancient Europe? Yes, but we need to be precise about what that means. The first modern humans in Europe had dark skin, a trait inherited from their African origins. This persisted for tens of thousands of years until agricultural lifestyles and genetic admixture led to lighter pigmentation. During the Roman period, African soldiers, merchants, and civilians lived in Europe, particularly in major urban centers and military zones. Their numbers were significant enough to leave archaeological, genetic, and documentary evidence. Medieval Europe recognized and venerated African figures, primarily in religious contexts, showing that black presence was known and, in cases like Saint Maurice, celebrated. However, these populations were never the demographic majority. Europe's population has always been primarily of European descent, with minority populations from elsewhere adding diversity. The evidence doesn't support claims of massive African populations in ancient Europe. Nor does it support the narrative of complete racial homogeneity until modern times. The truth, as usual, is nuanced. On this channel, I don't take political sides. I present evidence and let you draw conclusions. What's clear is that genetic science has revolutionized our understanding of ancient populations. The technology to extract and analyze ancient DNA has only existed for about 20 years. Each year brings new discoveries. Some of these discoveries challenge long-held assumptions. That's how science works. When evidence contradicts theory, we revise the theory. The emotional reactions to this research reveal how deeply history is tied to identity. For some, evidence of racial diversity in ancient Europe feels threatening to cultural heritage. For others, it's validation of long-dismissed perspectives. But the bones don't care about our politics. DNA doesn't have an agenda. The evidence is what it is. What's undeniable is that human history is far more complex, mobile, and interconnected than simplified narratives suggest. Populations have always migrated. Genes have always mixed. Skin color has always adapted to local conditions over time. The idea of racially pure populations unchanged for millennia is a myth, not just in Europe, but everywhere. Modern genetic analysis shows that virtually all populations are mixtures of earlier ancestral groups. This is true for Europeans, Africans, Asians, and indigenous peoples worldwide. We are all, ultimately, related, descendants of those first modern humans who left Africa and spread across the planet. The story of ancient Europe's population history is part of that larger human story. It's a story of migration, adaptation, mixing, and survival. And it's a story still being written as new discoveries emerge from the ground, and new technologies allow us to read the genetic messages written in ancient bones. If you want to explore this topic further, I recommend looking into 1. The Natural History Museum's Cheddar Man Research Project and FAQ 2. The University of Reading's Studies on Roman Britain Diversity 3. Research on Saint Maurice and Medieval African Presence in Europe 4. Genetic studies on European population history published in Nature and Science Journals 5. The work of scholars like Dr. Tom Booth, Professor Mark Thomas, and Dr. Hella Eckhart. The academic research is accessible online, complete with methodology, data sets, and peer review. This story is part of a bigger shift in how we understand human history. For centuries, history was written primarily by and about elite populations in dominant cultures. Archaeology, genetics, and improved methods now allow us to hear from people who left no written records. Prehistoric hunter-gatherers, ordinary Roman soldiers, medieval peasants. Their bones tell stories that written history often ignored or misunderstood. As technology improves, we'll continue discovering surprising truths about our ancestors. Each generation rewrites history, not because the past changes, but because we develop better tools to understand it. I never try to take sides in controversies like this. My goal is to present the evidence as clearly as possible and let you think critically about it. The question, were there black people in ancient Europe, has a factual answer based on archaeological and genetic evidence. But the emotional and political reactions to that evidence reveal deeper questions about identity, heritage, and how we relate to the past. Those deeper questions each of us must grapple with ourselves. What's certain is that the human story is far richer, stranger, and more interconnected than we often imagine. And that, ultimately, is what makes history so fascinating.